In the year 79 AD, on what started as an ordinary Tuesday morning, 20,000 people were going about their lives in a Roman city on the Bay of Naples. By the following dawn, they were gone. You know the story. You've seen the pictures, those haunting plaster figures frozen mid-stride, mid-scream, mid-embrace. School textbooks give you the broad strokes. Volcano erupts, ash falls, city buried, civilization preserved. What they don't tell you is what those 20,000 people actually experienced in the 19 hours between that first explosion and their deaths. What they don't tell you is that the eruption had two phases, and the second one was so much worse than the first that the people who survived the night thought they had made it. They thought the worst was over. They were wrong. If you've ever stood in front of one of those plaster casts in a museum and felt like something was being left unsaid, this is for you. After this, you won't just know what happened at Pompeii. You'll understand what it felt like to be there. The decisions people made, the ones who got out and the ones who didn't. And the discoveries made in the last 5 years that have rewritten everything we thought we knew about how those people died. Here's the part that makes this more than ancient history. 3 million people live within the danger zone of Vesuvius today. The city of Naples is just 8 miles from the crater. And the same sequence of events that killed Pompeii, scientists confirmed in 2023 could happen again. Understanding what actually happened to Pompeii isn't academic. It's a warning. Pompeii was not a backwater. It was a thriving commercial port city, one of the wealthiest in the Roman Empire. Its streets were paved with volcanic stone, worn smooth by cartwheels. It had a 20,000-seat amphitheater, one of the first purpose-built arenas for gladiatorial combat in Roman history. It had running water, public baths, and fast food counters called thermopolia, where you could grab a hot meal from terracotta pots embedded in stone countertops. Archaeologists have found campaign graffiti scratched into the walls, including election slogans, insults, and the names of favorite gladiators. This was a city people liked. People chose to live here. The mountain loomed over all of it the way mountains do, as backdrop, not threat. The Romans knew it was a volcano technically, but it had been quiet for 800 years. Long enough that by 79 AD, the slopes of Vesuvius were covered in vineyards. Farmers worked the soil up near the summit. The rich, mineral-dense earth that volcanoes leave behind makes for extraordinary wine. Pompeii was known throughout the empire for it. 17 years before the eruption, in 62 AD, a major earthquake had shaken the region. The philosopher Seneca wrote about it, noting it had largely demolished the populous Campanian town of Pompeii. Buildings were still being rebuilt in 79 AD. Workers were actively restoring temples and public spaces. The Pompeians rebuilt. They had no reason to believe this was anything other than the normal seismic activity of the region. Tremors were common in Campania. You got used to them. In the days before the eruption, small earthquakes had been increasing in frequency. For 4 days, the ground had been murmuring, but it had always murmured. There was nothing to suggest that this time was different. The eruption did not begin with fire. It began with sound. A detonation, described by the only eyewitness who left a written record, a 17-year-old named Pliny the Younger, watching from across the Bay of Naples, looked like a cloud rising from the summit in the shape of an umbrella pine. Not a wall of fire, a column. Within minutes, that column was rising 20 miles into the stratosphere. Here is the first thing history books underemphasize. The eruption had 2 completely distinct phases, and the first one gave people time to run. For the first 18 hours after that initial explosion, Vesuvius was in what volcanologists call its Plinian phase. The volcano was not throwing fire down the mountain, it was throwing debris straight up, volcanic rock, ash, and pumice stone. Launched into the atmosphere at supersonic speed, and carried by wind directly over Pompeii. What fell on the city that afternoon was pumice, light, porous rock, the same material you might find in a bathroom today. They were the size of fists, raining from the sky at 15 centimeters per hour, hour after hour. The daylight choked out. The city plunged into what Pliny called a darkness. Not the dark of a cloudy night, but a darkness like being in a sealed room with the lights off. People had a choice. Leave now through falling rock, through streets that were rapidly filling, through a sky that had swallowed the sun, or stay in shelter. Wait it out. Surely this had to stop. Most people left. The majority of Pompeii's residents, archaeologists estimate over 2/3, survived. They made it out during those first 18 hours. They are the reason the story of Pompeii was written down at all. The ones who died were the ones who stayed. Some stayed by choice. Some stayed because they were too old or too sick to run. Some stayed because they were enslaved and had no choice. Their owners left without them or locked them in. One cast found by archaeologists shows a man face down on a floor, an iron shackle still around his ankle, in the room where he died. And some stayed because they survived the first phase and they thought they had won. By 8 p.m., Pompeii was under 2 meters of pumice. Buildings were collapsing from the weight, but the sky directly above had grown quieter. The column was still erupting, but there was a deceptive sense that the worst was passing. Some accounts suggest people began moving through the streets again. A few may have returned to their homes. What none of them knew, what they could not have known, was that the eruption column was becoming unstable. For 18 hours, Vesuvius had been a geyser, erupting upward. At 7:06 in the evening, researchers now calculate, the eruption column became too heavy to sustain itself. The column, 5 miles across and 20 miles tall, began to collapse. When an eruption column collapses, the material it was carrying does not scatter. It does not drift. It falls, and then it runs. What geologists call pyroclastic density currents, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock fragments began racing down the flanks of Vesuvius. Not flowing, racing, at speeds of 100 to 180 miles per hour. The temperature inside those currents was between 300 and 700 degrees Celsius. The first surges hit Herculaneum, a smaller coastal town 11 miles from Pompeii, at approximately 1 in the morning. Herculaneum was closer to the mountain. The people sheltering on its beach, roughly 300 of them crammed into boathouses along the waterfront waiting for rescue ships that were never going to come, were engulfed in seconds. Here is what happened to them. This is not in the textbooks. In 2018, researchers from Federico II University Hospital in Naples published a study examining more than 100 skeletal remains from those boathouses. They found red and black mineral residue on the bones. Spectroscopic analysis revealed the residue was iron and iron oxides, the chemical signature of vaporized blood. The surge that hit Herculaneum was between 400 and 900 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, blood does not boil in the conventional sense. It vaporizes. The steam pressure generated inside the skull has nowhere to go. The skulls exploded. Lead researcher Dr. Pier Paolo Petrone described the death as instant. He called it fulminant shock. The bodies showed no signs of any voluntary self-protective reaction. No arms raised, no last-second flinching. The vital activity stopped in less time than the conscious mind could register what was happening. The only mercy Herculaneum received was speed. For Pompeii, the sequence was different. 6 separate pyroclastic surges came down the mountain between 2 a.m. and approximately 7:30 a.m. on August 25th. Each one was larger than the last. The first 3 surges stopped short of Pompeii. They devastated the surrounding farmland. People still in the city may have heard them. They may have felt the ground shake, but the surges had not reached them yet. The 4th surge crossed the city walls. The temperature at Pompeii was lower than at Herculaneum, roughly 300 degrees Celsius, or about 570 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature was still enough to kill instantly. But this temperature difference is responsible for something that makes Pompeii uniquely haunting compared to any other disaster site in human history. At 570 degrees, the surge was hot enough to kill instantly, but not quite hot enough to vaporize soft tissue in the same way. Instead, the ash hardened around the bodies while they were still intact. Over the following centuries, the flesh decayed inside the hardened shell. What remained was a hollow cavity in the rock, filled with bones, an exact, perfectly shaped negative of a human being at the moment of death. In 1863, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli noticed 4 strange cavities in the hardened ash layer and poured plaster into them. What emerged were 4 people, frozen in their last moments. The technique he invented is still used today. More than 80 plaster casts have been recovered. One cast shows a man still climbing a staircase, 1 foot raised, as if he still believed he could get high enough. Another shows a woman curled around an infant. There is the cast of a dog, still chained to its post, collar buckled. There is a family of 4 sheltering under a staircase, in the house of the golden bracelet. 2 adults and 2 children. The staircase collapsed on them, and they all died together. And there is the cast that stops most people cold. A man alone, arms raised, knees bent. Archaeologists once described the position as self-protective. Dr. Petroni has since corrected that interpretation. The contraction was involuntary. Post-mortem. The pugilist position caused by heat-shrinking muscle fiber after death. He was not protecting himself. He was already gone. For decades, a skeleton found at Herculaneum in 1961 was cataloged and mostly overlooked. A young man, probably in his 20s, found in what had been a civic building, likely a custodian of the space, which is why researchers began calling him the custodian. He had been lying on his bed when the eruption reached him. When archaeologists examined his skull, they found something they had never seen before. Scattered inside the cranial cavity were fragments of a shiny, black, glassy material. They did not know what it was. In 2020, a scientific team led by Dr. Pier Paolo Petrone and volcanologist Guido Giordano published a study in the journal PLOS 1. Using scanning electron microscopy and a neural image processing tool they built specifically for the analysis, they identified what the glass actually contained. Neurons, intact, 2,000-year-old neurons, axons, myelin sheaths, proteins specific to human brain tissue. The heat of the eruption had been intense enough and the cooling rapid enough to trigger a process called vitrification. The custodian's brain had not burned. It had not rotted. It had turned to glass. It is the only known example of organic glass containing human brain matter ever found anywhere in the world. Scientists who study neurological disease have noted that the 2,000-year-old neurons from Herculaneum are better preserved than samples from modern laboratory conditions. The eruption that destroyed everything preserved one man's mind perfectly. Here's what most people get wrong about Pompeii. The story we carry, the frozen city, the beautiful preservation, the poignant casts, is a story shaped by the 18th century when European excavators first uncovered the ruins and were transfixed by what they found. Loaves of bread still in the oven, graffiti on the walls, a dog mid-bark, the romance of it, a civilization caught mid-sentence. That framing turned a catastrophe into a cabinet of curiosities. Something to marvel at, something to visit on a school trip. What the research of the last decade has quietly established is something different. The 79 AD eruption of Vesuvius was not a gentle burial. It was not a slow drowning in ash. For the thousands who did not get out, it was a sequence of physical processes so extreme, they have no real modern equivalent short of a nuclear event. The pyroclastic surges at Herculaneum reached temperatures comparable to the thermal radiation zone of a nuclear detonation. Blood vaporized, skulls burst, brains were turned to glass. For the people of Pompeii, 6 successive waves of superheated material came down that mountain between 2 in the morning and 7:30 in the morning. Each one arrived approximately 80 minutes after the last. The people who survived 3 surges, 4 surges, who may have believed they were going to make it through to dawn, were not spared. The 6th surge was the largest. Approximately half of the bodies found in Pompeii were discovered in the streets. Not in houses, not sheltering, in the streets. They were trying to run. The version in the history books is true. Every detail of it is true. But the version that leaves out the 19 hours of noise and darkness and pumice rain and the 6 invisible walls of fire that came down the mountain in the dark, that version has been doing its subjects a disservice for 2.5 centuries. These were people. They made choices. They miscalculated. Some of them almost made it. And the same volcano that killed them still sits 8 miles from the center of Naples, silent and green-sloped, with 3 million people in its shadow who have grown as accustomed to it as the Pompeians were. The official emergency plan for a Vesuvius eruption today estimates that residents would have 72 hours to evacuate. 72 hours for 3 million people. The Pompeians had 18 hours. When Giuseppe Fiorelli poured plaster into those first 4 cavities in 1863 and pulled out the casts of a family in its final moments, he described the experience as like having an eyewitness step forward from antiquity, someone who had been waiting 1,800 years to be seen. What the last decade of research has done is listen to what those witnesses are actually saying. Not just where they fell, not just how they looked, but the physics of what tore through them, the exact temperature, the speed, the sequence. Pliny the Elder, the greatest naturalist of the Roman world, the man who sailed toward the eruption to study it and to help, died on the beach trying to reassure terrified citizens that the flames in the distance were just abandoned farmhouses burning. He went to sleep in a friend's villa as the surges began and never woke up. The full horror of Pompeii is not in what was destroyed. It's in how long it took, and how many people thought at some point during those 19 hours that they were going to be okay. Remember that when you look at the casts, they're not sculptures. They're the last question 2,000 people ever asked.